They told you Salem was about witches. That's the lie that survived. What if the most dangerous person in the witch trials wasn't executed, but erased? An enslaved woman, a stolen name, a confession so powerful it reshaped history and then vanished. Because Salem wasn't madness. It was a system, and once you see how it worked, you'll realize it never ended. They erased her name on purpose, not with fire, not with force, but with silence. A single word survives in the record, TITUBA. And even that feels like a mistake someone forgot to correct. Because what she knew, what she said, was never meant to outlive her. Listen carefully now, not like a student, like a man standing at the edge of something dangerous. In 1692, Salem didn't explode into madness by accident. It was engineered. Fear was cultivated the way crops are cultivated, slowly, deliberately, until it could feed power. And the first seed was planted in the body of an enslaved woman whose voice terrified men who claimed to speak for God. TITUBA was not just a servant. She was not just the first witch. That's the lie you were given because the truth is harder to control. She came from a world the Puritans couldn't dominate, a world where knowledge wasn't written in books approved by churches, but carried in memory, in rhythm, in plants, in stories whispered at night. To men obsessed with order, she represented chaos, and chaos, when named correctly, becomes a weapon. Salem was already rotting long before the trials began. It was a pressure cooker of envy, land hunger, religious paranoia, and male insecurity disguised as righteousness. These men preached purity while hoarding power. They spoke of God while sharpening knives behind closed doors, and they needed an enemy they could fully destroy without consequence. TITUBA was perfect. She had no surname, no legal standing, no protection. Her body was owned. Her voice was not. That terrified them. What history books won't tell you is this. When TITUBA spoke during her confession, parts of it were removed. Not lost, removed. Because she didn't just describe devils and specters, she described systems, hierarchies, meetings, a structure of control that mirrored the very men judging her. And for a moment, just a moment, the mirror turned back on them. That could not be allowed. So they reframed her. They turned her into a caricature, a hysterical slave, a superstitious woman, anything but what she actually was, a living threat to institutional authority. Salem didn't fear witches. It feared loss of control. By the winter of 1691, the village was already split clean down the spine, not by faith, but by power. Land disputes, inherited grudges, men who believed God owed them prosperity and couldn't accept that the world wasn't obeying. When crops failed and borders blurred and wars raged just beyond the trees, they didn't ask why. They asked who. Fear always looks for a face. The Puritan leadership understood something most people never do. Terror is easier to manage than truth. A frightened population doesn't demand evidence. It demands certainty. And certainty, even false certainty, feels like salvation. Reverend Samuel Parris was not a holy man trapped in hysteria. He was a failed merchant who learned that spiritual authority could succeed where business had not. From the pulpit, he didn't preach hope. He preached siege, invisible enemies, corruption hiding in plain sight, a righteous few surrounded by traitors disguised as neighbors. This wasn't religion, it was psychological conditioning. And in that environment, TITUBA became more than an enslaved woman. She became a container, a vessel into which the village could pour everything it hated about itself, but could not admit. She spoke with an accent. She remembered another world. She carried knowledge that didn't pass through male hands or church approval. Herbs, stories, interpretations of nature that didn't require permission. That kind of autonomy is intolerable to rigid systems. Understand this clearly. Witchcraft accusations were not about magic. They were about unauthorized knowledge. When the girls began to convulse, it wasn't just illness or hysteria. It was theater shaped by expectation. Children absorb power dynamics instinctively. They learn quickly what brings attention, protection, authority. And in Salem, suffering became currency. But the adults, especially the men, were not confused. They were opportunistic. The moment the doctor declared the evil hand, the narrative locked in. From that point on, every scream became evidence. Every denial became guilt. Logic collapsed under the weight of collective fear, and in that vacuum, accusation became law. And here's the detail that matters. The accusations didn't rise randomly. They followed fault lines, property lines, old feuds, political fractures disguised as moral outrage. TITUBA stood at the intersection of all of it: race, enslavement, foreignness, gender. She embodied everything the Puritan order defined itself against. So when the net tightened, it was never a question of if she would be accused. TITUBA watched them before they ever watched her. From the shadows of the parsonage, from the quiet corners of rooms where servants were expected to disappear, she learned the rhythms of power. Who spoke loudly, who hesitated, who needed obedience to feel whole. Enslavement sharpens perception in ways comfort never can. When your survival depends on reading men accurately, you learn fast. She saw Reverend Parris's fear long before he named it holy. She saw his resentment curdle into sermons. She saw how authority fed on affirmation, how men grew bolder when their words produced trembling instead of resistance. And most importantly, she saw what happened when someone refused to play their assigned role. The Puritans believed knowledge flowed downward. God to minister, minister to man, man to woman, woman to child. Any deviation from that order was rebellion disguised as sin. TITUBA's very existence broke that chain. She knew things no man had taught her. She remembered worlds no sermon could erase. That made her dangerous. When the girls listened to her stories, it wasn't the content that mattered most. It was the reversal. A black, enslaved woman became the voice. White daughters of authority became listeners. For those hours, hierarchy collapsed. And once hierarchy cracks, it never fully heals. This is the part history avoids because it's uncomfortable. The girls didn't just imitate symptoms, they imitated power. They learned that pain commanded attention, that visions outranked facts, that suffering, when performed correctly, could override male authority itself. They learned it fast, and they learned it from watching adults respond. But TITUBA saw further. When she was arrested, beaten, dragged before men who already believed they knew the truth, she made a decision that saved her life and doomed dozens of others. She didn't resist the story, she expanded it. A denial would have meant death. Silence would have meant erasure. But confession gave her control. Because confession, in a system obsessed with sin, becomes authorship. So she gave them what they craved. A universe where their fears were justified. A devil that wore familiar faces. A conspiracy large enough to explain their failures and absolve their cruelty. But she did something subtle, something lethal. She described the devil like a man they already feared. A tall figure, dressed in black, from Boston, educated, commanding. She mirrored their own elite back at them through myth, and they didn't notice, because fear blinds upward. TITUBA didn't invent chaos. She redirected it. Once the door was opened, it could never be closed again. TITUBA's confession didn't calm Salem, it electrified it. The magistrates leaned forward, hungry, because now the nightmare had structure. Names, meetings, books, contracts signed in blood. Fear loves detail. Detail makes imagination feel like evidence. And here's what no one admits. The court needed her to keep talking. The trials weren't about discovering truth. They were about sustaining momentum. A witch hunt without new witches collapses under its own absurdity. So every confession became a demand for more. More names, more visions, more proof that the terror was real and expanding. This is how systems turn self-perpetuating. Once spectral evidence was accepted, once dreams, visions, and accusations with no physical proof became legally valid, the laws of reality no longer mattered. Anyone could be guilty, everyone was vulnerable, and that vulnerability was the point. Men who had never held power suddenly found themselves able to destroy reputations with a sentence. Girls who had never been heard could now command silence from entire rooms. Ministers who feared losing relevance discovered they could extend their authority indefinitely by feeding the panic. Salem became addicted. Neighbors accused neighbors not because they believed, but because disbelief became dangerous. Silence looked like complicity. Skepticism looked like witchcraft. To survive, you had to participate. And yet, Tituba disappeared from the center of the storm, not because she was forgiven, because she was no longer useful. After her confession, she was locked away, forgotten, left to rot in a jail she could not pay to escape. While white women who denied the charges were marched to the gallows, Tituba lived, not as mercy, but as neglect. That should disturb you, because it reveals the unspoken rule of the trials. Execution was reserved for those whose deaths reinforced social order: property holders, church members, people whose elimination sent a message. Tituba's death would have said nothing. Her survival was not compassion, it was strategy. She was proof the system worked. The obedient sinners spared, the disobedient righteous destroyed, and as bodies began to hang from trees, the story was rewritten in real time. The enslaved woman who started it all was reduced to a footnote, a curiosity, a stereotype, conveniently stripped of complexity. Her voice, once too dangerous to ignore, became too inconvenient to remember. History likes clean villains. It likes madness without motive. It likes witches better than systems, because systems implicate everyone. After the hanging stopped, the silence was louder than the screams. No public reckoning came, no grand confession of guilt. Salem didn't wake up one morning horrified by what it had done. It simply moved on. That's how collective violence usually ends, not with clarity, but with exhaustion. The courts quietly dissolved. Spectral evidence was suddenly unreliable. The same men who once declared visions unquestionable now pretended they had always been cautious. Apologies were written years later, carefully worded to admit error, without admitting intent. And Tituba? She vanished, not into myth, but into poverty. Records suggest she was sold again, passed from hand to hand, her fate unimportant now that her purpose had been served. The woman whose words ignited the deadliest witch hunt in American history was denied even a documented ending. That absence is not accidental. History doesn't just forget people like Tituba. It erases them because remembering would force uncomfortable questions. Questions about why her confession was believed while others' denials were ignored. About why enslaved knowledge was labeled demonic the moment it challenged authority. About why survival itself was framed as guilt. The official story wants you to believe Salem was a tragic misunderstanding, a brief lapse into superstition, a lesson learned. But look closer. The trials ended not because people realized witches weren't real, but because the accusations began creeping upward. When respected men, merchants, and ministers found themselves named, fear suddenly became inconvenient. Skepticism returned the moment power felt threatened. That pattern never changed. Scapegoats are only useful while they are disposable. Tituba's greatest crime was not witchcraft, it was adaptability. She understood the rules faster than her captors and bent them just enough to survive. For that, history punished her twice, first with enslavement, then with silence. And here's the darkest truth of all: survival under oppression is often rewritten as guilt. The dead become martyrs, the living become suspects. So when modern retellings portray Tituba as the villain, the spark that caused Salem, they're continuing the same logic the Puritans used. Blame the lowest, protect the structure, move on. But structures don't move on, they mutate. Salem is comfortable to remember as a relic, a cautionary tale safely locked in the past. Buckled shoes, wooden gallows, superstition we believe ourselves superior to. That comfort is the lie. Because Salem didn't end, it evolved. The witch hunt was never about magic, it was about permission. Permission to suspend doubt. Permission to replace evidence with emotion. Permission to punish people not for what they did, but for what they represented. Once that permission is granted, it doesn't expire. In every era, the language changes, but the structure stays intact. Witch becomes traitor. Heresy becomes subversion. The devil's mark becomes dangerous ideology. And the crowd reacts the same way it always has. Relief at finally having someone to fear together. TITUBA's story matters because she exposes the mechanics in their rawest form. She shows us how power listens selectively, how truth spoken from the wrong mouth becomes heresy, how marginalized voices are only welcomed when they confirm the narrative already chosen. Even her confession, so often framed as deception or manipulation, was an act of survival within an impossible cage. People love to debate whether she lied, as if honesty exists freely under torture, as if truth survives well when pain is the interviewer. That question misses the point. The real deception was the system pretending it sought truth at all. Salem didn't punish lies, it punished refusal to conform. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. The trials didn't rely on monsters. They relied on ordinary people doing what systems reward. Judges protected their authority, ministers protected their relevance, neighbors protected themselves. Even the accusers protected the fragile power they'd never had before. Nobody thought they were the villain. They thought they were being responsible. That's why Salem is not an anomaly. It's a warning that keeps being ignored. Because the moment fear becomes a moral duty, the moment questioning is framed as betrayal, the moment survival requires accusation, there is a reason TITUBA never got a redemption arc. Redemption requires closure, names, dates, graves. It requires a system willing to admit it was wrong. Salem offered none of that, because admitting the truth would have meant dismantling the very foundations that protected its leaders. So instead, history softened the edges. Textbooks turned terror into trivia. A few paragraphs, a list of victims, a moral neatly packaged, fear is bad, don't repeat this. And in doing so, they stripped the story of its teeth. TITUBA became a symbol without agency, a shadow, sometimes Caribbean, sometimes African, sometimes imagined as mystical, sometimes monstrous, rarely human. Her inner world was irrelevant to those who preferred her flattened into a cautionary prop. Because a fully realized TITUBA is dangerous. She forces us to confront how enslaved people were expected to be both invisible and all-knowing, blamed for chaos while denied control. She exposes how women's voices were feared most when they demonstrated insight. She reminds us that intelligence without permission has always been labeled as threat, and she ruins the fantasy that Salem was a mistake made by ignorant people. These were educated men, literate, theologically trained. They knew what evidence was. They abandoned it deliberately because it stood in the way of authority. That is not ignorance, that is choice. And choices echo. Look at who history rushes to forgive, judges who regretted their actions later in life, ministers who claimed they were misled, communities that apologized once the damage was irreversible. Then look at who remains condemned or forgotten. The dead women whose last words were prayers, the imprisoned who never recovered, the enslaved woman whose survival made her suspicious forever. Salem didn't just kill people, it taught a lesson. It taught that power can outlive truth, that narratives, once institutionalized, don't need facts, and that those at the bottom will always absorb the blame when systems collapse. TITUBA's silence at the end of her life is not a mystery, it's the final act of control. But silence has a strange habit. It doesn't disappear. It waits. Long after the gallows rotted and the courtroom emptied, Salem's logic kept traveling, carried quietly into laws, churches, newspapers, and schools. The names changed, the accusations modernized, but the emotional machinery stayed intact. Every time a society decides that fear is proof, every time a crowd accepts accusation without evidence, every time a person is reduced to a symbol instead of a human being, Salem is happening again. This is why TITUBA matters now more than ever. She represents a kind of knowledge that power has always tried to suffocate. Lived knowledge. Knowledge born from survival, not status. From observation, not authority. Systems hate that kind of wisdom because it can't be credentialed, regulated, or easily discredited. Only demonized. Notice the pattern. When panic spreads, who gets blamed first? The foreign, the poor, the racially marked, the women who speak too clearly, the people with the least protection and the most visibility. It's never random. And just like in Salem, once the machine starts, Backing out becomes impossible without consequences. To question the narrative is to risk becoming the next target, so people comply. They share the accusations. They repeat the slogans. They tell themselves they're just being careful. That's how moral responsibility dissolves. TITUBA understood this instinctively. That's why she survived. She didn't believe the system was just. She believed it was predictable, and she navigated it the only way available to her. History punishes her for that. We prefer victims who die cleanly, who don't adapt, who don't complicate the story. Survival makes people uneasy because it suggests intelligence under oppression, and that threatens the myth that power is natural and deserved. So TITUBA remains uncomfortable, unfinished, unredeemed. A reminder that evil doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like procedure, paperwork, courtrooms, respectable men nodding in agreement. And if that realization makes you uneasy, it should. TITUBA never got a grave, no marker, no prayer, no final sentence history could neatly underline, and that may be the most honest ending of all, because Salem was never meant to resolve. It was meant to warn. A warning we keep misreading because it's easier to blame hysteria than to confront intention. Easier to blame superstition than to admit how eagerly power abandons truth when fear becomes useful. TITUBA did not create the witch hunt. She revealed it. She stood at the fault line where race, gender, enslavement, and authority collided, and the ground cracked open. What poured out wasn't evil magic. It was the ugly machinery of control, men protecting status, institutions preserving dominance, communities choosing survival over justice. And when the blood dried, they did what systems always do. They erased the witness. But erasure isn't victory, it's confession. Because the fact that TITUBA still unsettles us, still resists a clean moral, is proof that her story survived its executioners. She reminds us that innocence doesn't guarantee safety, that truth doesn't protect you, and that survival itself can be treated as a crime when it exposes the lie. Salem didn't burn witches. It burned doubt. It burned dissent. It burned the courage to say, "Prove it." And every time a society chooses fear over evidence, every time accusation replaces accountability, every time the powerless are blamed so the powerful can sleep at night, TITUBA is there, watching, waiting, unforgotten, because the most dangerous stories are not the ones that end in death, but the ones that explain why it happened. And now that you know that, you'll never hear the word witch hunt the same way again.